I don't know whether it's a good or a bad thing that there aren't enough seats for all of you, but I would like to just welcome you here to the stegi. I am a part of the group that actually runs this whole outfit, and of course we're talking about issues which go beyond cultural events. It's something which is really part and parcel of everyday life, and I think that people have shown such keen interest both here and through the internet. This isn't a hospital environment. This is a different environment for us to be able to discuss pain. Is it somatic? Is it class? Is it a class issue? We all know, of course, what pain feels like, even if we don't actually know what it is as such. My thanks are due to the speakers, as well as Dimitris Papanikolaou for his very warm welcome and productive collaboration with us. I think we ought to be able to start now. Thank you. Okay, well, I will start just by saying that when just under a year ago we had the idea of inviting Joanna Bourke, I had just read her book, in fact, which was a recent book on pain, and of course we know about Joanna's work overall, as well as the pain book. And Afroditi Panagiotakou said that this is a very topical issue. So for you who are here or even outside with the screen that we've set out outside for you, or those of you who are in front of your computer, perhaps you've decided to watch us on the internet. Well, obviously the issue of pain is something which is of interest to you. So we were absolutely sure that a lot of people would be interested in the subject of pain, but I've been rather surprised at the turnout and the keen interest demonstrated by all of you upon the arrival of Joanna in Athens. What is it that makes pain such a subject of keen interest? What do people actually understand when we talk about pain? How do we know how to describe pain? And also, how is this going to link us up with other people? Now, these are questions with which I think Joanna Bourke also starts with in the pain book in the beginning. And we've shifted this to centre stage for the focus of our discussions this evening. She says it's not an individual issue. It should not remain inside us, that you must communicate pain, explain it, and make it a reason for recounting and relating. Pain is a social issue, but it's also of a social size. In other words, we live in societies which teach us how to feel pain, but also to forget pain, and that societies choose whose pain is to be dealt with and whose pain is to be underestimated. Now, she reminds us that our basic collective resistance is to share pain, and we do actually do that within a community with a spirit of collectivism. And Joanna Bourke reminds us of a work which is very important, wherein pain is being linked into the pain of somebody else. There's a linking of pain, in other words, from one person to another. And of course, as concerns the history of pain and the importance of discussing pain, we'll start this with Joanna Bourke and three other Greek speakers whom I will actually present when it comes to their particular presentation. For the moment, perhaps I can just introduce our keynote speaker, Joanna Bourke, who is a professor of history at Birkbeck College, University of London. And of course, she has 10 books in her collection that she's written. And I think that a lot of you might remember or understand the importance of this because she has basically brought a new feeling into the concept of fear, of war, of violence. And she has brought all of those issues right to the focus of history, because history is not simply a matter of main events, whether they're political or are they acts of war. It is a matter of feelings and also how those feelings are reflected in society and through culture, and what happens through violence and pain, love, feelings, images, imagination, fantasies. And I think her book also, her writings do depict very well this issue. She tries to make the whole issue very accessible to a broad public without, of course, losing any poignancy in terms of her arguments. And her books, which you may or may not know, An Intimate History of Killing, Fear, A Cultural History, Rape, a history from 1860 to the present, rape, well, he's just translating it into Greek, what it means to be human. In 2014, Joanna Bourke. Well, I really don't understand how you've managed to do so many things in 1 year. You published 2 books, The History of Pain, which we start with today. After many years of research and the University of London Research Programme on the World Contrast, and Wood in the World also, How Military Violence and War Games Invade Our Lives. So this is a book about violence, as the title says, and war games basically become a part of our everyday lives. And last week I asked her to tell me what is the leitmotif in her works. What is it that links these different books together? Well, I've been listening, she said, for many years to the voices of other people, and listening to the voice of women and people who are oppressed and minorities and persecuted. But of course, what comes through is people who try to inflict pain on these groups, on the women, on people who are persecuted or oppressed. In my book about pain, I wanted to sort of change the focus and move to the victims and their pain. And my interest, of course, is still the same throughout the whole of my work, which is basically everyday pain. Unlike politics or the traditional military history one deals in. So it's a great honour today to have you with us here, Joanna, as a speaker on this very important issue. Joanna Bourke, thank you for coming in all the way from London to speak to us.
I always get very embarrassed when people do long introductions because I think to myself, it can only go downhill from now onwards. Thank you very much for that. Of course, Greece is my second home, so I'm particularly honoured and thrilled to be able to come and speak here at the Onassis Cultural Centre, which of course has such an international reputation, and I'm very, very grateful for this invitation and of course for everyone here coming. And I also have to say I'm very grateful to the translator as well, or translators, and I apologize for my lack of adequate Greek. But of course my final thanks must of course go to Dimitris, who is a friend, a colleague, but also actually an intellectual extraordinaire who has made a big impact, a huge impact, I think, on the way a lot of us think about culture, literature, but also about history. And so I'm really grateful to be sitting and pleased, honoured to be sitting next to him. But of course, this book, History of Pain, how did I come to write it? I still remember very, very clearly when I was in hospital after a major operation. And I was lying in bed, and you know they give you those morphine pumps that you push and you're supposed to feel great all of a sudden. You know all about this. Well, I was pushing this morphine pump, and it wasn't working. And actually, I was in quite a lot of pain. And I was trying to distract myself. And a friend of mine had given me a book to distract me in hospital. A wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's by Virginia Woolf, and it's called On Being Ill. And it's a little booklet published in 1928, really relevant for us today. And I was reading this book, trying to distract myself, and in this book she explains that, when you're in pain, language seems to disappear. Pain is inexpressible. It's beyond culture. It's beyond culture. It's beyond expression. And I was very, very interested in this argument that, you couldn't speak about pain beyond language. And then, of course, my partner came to visit, and visiting hours, Professor Kostas Thuzinas, who some of you may know. And I remember talking to him very excitedly about this book and explaining that pain is beyond language, inexpressible, and beyond culture in many ways. And I remember him looking at him and seeing his voice, his face kind of changed. And he turned to me and he said, "Do you know, Joanna, you have been talking for an entire hour about the fact that you cannot express pain." And I thought this, as usual, he hits hits things correctly. And then he went on, and I think really in a really interesting way, he said, perhaps the problem is not that people in pain have difficulty expressing it, but that witnesses to their pain don't want to hear it. And that was the moment I decided that this is the book that I wanted to write. But first, let's start with the actual problem that we have, the problem of pain. 1814, Sergeant Thomas Jackson, soldier in the Coldstream Guards, was very seriously wounded in battle. And of course, he prepared for the amputation of his leg with a kind of mixture of bellicosity and bravado. Of course, this 1814 is 34 years before you have effective pain relief, before you have anesthetics like ether or chloroform. So in order to dull his pain, he was given some wine, which, as he wrote, raised my spirits to invincible courage. In this good mood, he refused to be blindfolded. "I shall sit still and see," he told the assembled gathering, before instructing the surgeon to go on as you please. One man grabbed his leg, others ripped his trousers, still other men held him down. When wielding a knife, he describes it as much like that of a shoemaker's, the surgeon tightened the tourniquet and, in his words, setting the edge of the knife on my shin bone, at one heavy, quick stroke, drew it round till it met with the shin bone again. Blood flowed downwards like a beautiful red flag. The surgeon then forced up the flesh towards the knee to make way for the saw. Now, when the surgeon starts sawing through the bone, Jackson's tone becomes distinctly less hardy. It was extremely painful, he remembered, because the saw was worn out and it got stuck, as a bad saw would when sawing a green stick. The operation lasted an agonizing half an hour. During subsequent dressings of this stump, bandages that were soldered together with clotted dried blood had grown to the flesh were brutally ripped out and his wounds reopened. Jackson recalled that my feeble strength ebbed away. I sank under the excruciating pain. And his bitterness, his absolute bitterness about the way he and, of course, his wounded comrades had been treated lasted his entire life. Now, Jackson's leg had been amputated in 1814, but his memoir was not published until 1847. That is, a year after the introduction of effective anesthetics and analgesics. Would Jackson have felt less bitter if he could have been put to sleep while his leg was removed, or with the invention of more effective anesthetics and analgesics simply never going to be able to compete with the inventiveness of men who were trying to devise new and more brutal ways of killing on the battlefield. How did, and of course how do, people give meaning to the suffering, to their own suffering? Some of these questions are the ones I address in the story of pain. Now, the immediate origin, of course, of my project was, of course, me in my hospital bed. I wasn't plied with wine, but unfortunately, my morphine pump was not working. And in a sense, as Dimitris has just said, in a sense, this book was a departure from earlier work of mine. The wrong direction. Books such as Dismembering the Male, books mainly on the history of warfare, but also on the history of fear and the history of rapists, are all things I've worked on in the past. And as you've also heard, I also published a book on militarization very, very recently, asking not only how have our societies become militarized, but also what we can actually do about them, which I think is equally important. But the pain book, is actually very, very different, I think, from these previous works. One of the things I personally found most surprising when I started reading around this area, reading letters and diaries in particular of people in pain, was actually the eloquence, the absolute eloquence of people when they were seeking, striving to communicate what they were going through to their loved ones. Now, it would be ridiculous to deny that, of course, people find it difficult. People in pain struggle to find the right words to communicate what they are feeling. But I think it is important to remember that pain is not the only feeling state that is difficult to communicate in words. Indeed, all strong feeling states, all strong feelings are really difficult to find the right words for. I mean, we only have to think about how we communicate parental love, for example, or how we put into words orgasmic delight. We always struggle with these kinds of strong sensations. Physicians and patients alike are very dependent on metaphor and analogy in order to communicate their pain. Like all experiences, but particularly those that are difficult, subjective, and very intense, when we're in those situations, we turn generally to metaphor and analogy. Metaphorical language profoundly useful in enabling people to communicate difficult things. And I think if we look carefully at the metaphors that people grasp in order to communicate, we can actually find hints about their unspoken meanings that they are giving to their suffering. This is why, when we look into history, we can see that the same people who declare their suffering to be unspeakable then, of course, go on to tell their story in exquisite detail, as I did in the hospital room. As a result, pain narratives can actually be productive. They're productive. They have a capacity to unite people in exhilarating and creative ways. Sufferers routinely and zealously seek to communicate their pain. They describe their pain as dull, mundos, or sharp, oxys, or even sweet, glucose. These are languages that people grasp in order to communicate pain. Other time, ordinary people, we're not talking about literary types like Virginia Woolf, ordinary people describe their pain using even much more complex and interesting metaphors. For example, in 1816, a man with a stomachache said that he felt like I have 7 devils in my belly. A working-class woman, 1894, explained, "Sometimes I feel like a hammer knocking in my belly. This week my breasts bite me so that I cannot describe it." And now, if that's not an eloquent description, I don't know what is. A former slave, writing in 1909, claimed, "I have a toothache 6 inches long in my hip." While a man whose leg had been amputated during the First World War complained, "My leg has a toothache." Toothache actually is one of the most common analogies used. My favorite, though, is this one. And this is one from 1960, where a migraine sufferer said that her headache, ponokephalos, felt like a bowl of screaming yellow zonkers popping hard behind my forehead. I think for those of you who don't know what yellow zonkers are, it was a very popular sort of sickly sweet in the 1960s. Or, as a Greek woman told me, tamat kanun, pael esirisi. I knew I was not going to get this right. Sto kefalimu.
Τα ματ κάνουν παρέλαση στο κεφάλι.
Thank you. I told you my Greek was impossible. Typically, people in pain give agency to their pain. In other words, they actually say that it's something like an enemy that attacks from within. In other words, they say it's kind of like a fire that burns, a dog that bites, a knife that stabs. As Greek linguist Professor Laskarastou argues, it makes a difference. It makes a difference, she argues, whether a person in pain uses the expressive first person pono or the impersonal third person ponai. As these examples suggest, pain itself does not kind of emerge naturally from physiological processes, but always in negotiations with social worlds. Now, what I found really interesting was it's actually surprisingly difficult to actually answer the question, well, what is pain? It's actually a difficult question to ask. The English noun pain encompasses a host of phenomena that are incommensurate. Pain, for example, is a label that adheres to scraped knees, to headaches, to phantom limbs, to kidney stones. It's assigned to heart attacks and, of course, to heart aches. The adjective painful is so broad that it actually can be applied to a toothache just as easily as to a boil, a burst appendix, or a birth. Furthermore, even the most cursory look at the historical record uncovers a headache-inducing range of theological, scientific, medical, and philosophical definitions of pain. My favorite one is in 1892, Nietzsche famously declared that I have given a name to my pain. It is dog. For him, pain was just as faithful, just as obtrusive and shameless, just as entertaining and just as clever as any other dog. And I can scold it and vent my bad mood on it as others do their dogs, servants, and wives. I think an apt analogy, even if not rather insulting to non-figurative servants and wives. However, if pain was a dog, it was a beast of gargantuan proportions. Nietzsche, of course, is adopting a functionalist definition of pain. In other words, his pain dog is defined by the function it served in the great philosopher's life. Such ways of conceptualizing pain have proliferated, obviously, for centuries. Theologians have assumed that pain is this kind of communique from a higher being, a chastising communique from a higher being. 19th century evolutionists contended that it was a mechanism to protect the organism from harm. Many clinicians from the late 19th century onwards have in fact drained pain of any meaning, any intrinsic meaning altogether, making it simply a symptom of something else, a disease. With brain imaging techniques in the 21st century, 20th and 21st centuries, the subjective person in pain, in fact, is eradicated altogether. In other words, pain sort of morphing into little more than an altered brain state. Still others have diced pain using still different scalpels. In innumerable ways, philosophers and scientists have sought to pare back pain to its bare skin and bones. So Descartes here, was pain, as he believed, a reaction of filaments and animal spirits to noxious stimuli? That's what he argued in the 17th century, and it actually was very prominent until the mid-19th century. Descartes, of course, became known for the Cartesian distinction between body and mind, arising largely from this very famous image of the mechanism of pain. So in this image, you see fast-moving particles of fire rushing up the nerve fiber from the foot towards the brain, where then it's supposed to activate animal spirits, which then travel back down the nerves, causing the foot to move away from the flame. So in other words, in this kind of model of pain, the body is simply a mechanism that works, as he put it, just as pulling on one end of a cord, one simultaneously rings a bell, which hangs at the opposite end. Still others, of course, fixed attention on the nerves, disagreeing about the specificity theory. In other words, the body has a separate system for dealing with pain versus pattern theory. Receptors for pain are shared with other senses such as touch. If you fast forward a century and a half later, the International Association for the Study of Pain, this is the most prominent one, defined pain as an unpleasant sensory and emotional, that's important, and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or described in terms of such damage. Crucially, this definition insists that sensory, cognitive, and affective processes influence people's actual experience of pain, which makes it very helpful, I think, particularly for the historian. But of course, it still doesn't help us understand what people in the past, or how people in the past thought about their suffering. In my view, I think it's very helpful to think of pain, or to begin, I guess, from the premise that pain is not an object, but a type of event. In other words, pain is a way of being. It's a way of being in the world. Pain events are unstable. They are historically constituted and reconstituted in relation to language, in relation to social and environmental interactions, and of course, bodily comportment. So in other words, if you put this another way, I think it's useful to think of pain in adverbal senses, in adverbal terms. Pain describes the way we feel about something, not what is experienced. So if that's where we're starting from, I guess the question, for at least for the historian, is, well, what does pain do? How has pain been done in the past and indeed today? What ideological work do acts of being in pain seek to achieve? And what are the mechanisms with which these types of events change? So how does change happen in terms of pain? Crucially, in other words, people do the act of pain in very different ways. And I think there's a lot of different ways of expressing this, but one way is that there is no pain event outside of context. So-called noxious stimuli, for example, may excite a shriek of distress, corporal punishment, or, of course, a squeal of delight, masochism. There is no necessary or proportionate connection between the intensity of tissue damage and the amount of suffering actually experienced. Since phenomena as different as battle enthusiasm, work satisfaction, spousal relationships, the color of a analgesic pill actually can determine the amount of pain actually felt. And people, of course, have no difficulty at all, using that same word, pain, to refer to a flu injection and to an ocular migraine. So although every individual is initiated into cultures of pain from birth, in fact, being in pain is far from stable or monochrome. which is why, of course, I think it needs a history, or I argue it needs a history. People can and do actually regularly challenge dominant beings in pain. Indeed, as I said earlier, the creative originality with which some people in pain draw on and transform stories and bodily performances of their suffering, I think is really, really striking. I think this approach to pain allows us to state that what people said is painful in the past is painful. In other words, the definition is respectful towards the ways people in the past and today have actually created and recreated their lives. Many aches and pains, after all, are not caused by bodily damage. People can suffer, yet be lesion-free. Most chronic pain states are like that. They can be in pain, excruciating pain, yet not possess the limb that is in pain, as in phantom pain. Phantom limb pain. They can even, in fact, have a limb blown off, very serious lesion, and not feel particularly in pain. And I think a really interesting example of this was done in 1944 during the Second World War. And this was the first systematic study of this kind of phenomena, where a person called Lieutenant Henry Beecher was dealing with men on the beachfront in Italy with very, very severe wounds. Most of them had limb amputations, stomach wounds, head wounds, very, very serious wounds. And him and his team interviewed hundreds of these very, very wounded soldiers and found to their surprise that, in fact, they did not feel pain. 4/5 said, when they asked, "Are you in pain?" said, "No." And when they were offered pain relief, they also said, "No, I don't need it," even though, of course, by being offered it, they were being told that it was available should they want it. So he tried to work out why it is that these severely wounded men were not in pain, even though they discovered if someone walked next to them and by mistake stood on their hand or their foot, they would yell, "Ouch," and swear at them. So it wasn't that they're insensitive, but they weren't feeling the severity of their pain. And he argued that, in his words, that the wartime wounding performed an important effect. It released the soldier from an exceedingly dangerous environment, one filled with fatigue, discomfort, anxiety, fear, real danger of death, and gives him a ticket to the safety of the hospital. His troubles are over, or so he thinks. And he went back to the States afterwards and did similar questions to severely wounded people from accidents, car accidents, and found that, of course, they were in extreme pain because, of course, for them, the trauma had actually just started. Everything good was all over. Okay. Put in another way, depending on the presence of other objects and other people, pain events lead to different feelings. Could lead to distress, face-to-face with a torturer, pride, gout in the 18th century, fear, panic, railway accident, anticipation, surprise, heart attack, relief, self-cutters, or, of course, joy, childbirth. I'm going to just end with just one final story here about the fundamental, just to illustrate the fundamental social nature of suffering by looking at the way one man called Joseph Townend wrote about pain near the end of the 19th century. This is a really amazing account that we've got because, of course, it's written by a very, very poor laborer in late 19th century Britain. He's a poor manual laborer. And for him, pain was an event that adhered to some acts, but not others. In other words, he never mentions pain when he's talking about the lingering deaths of his 4 siblings. His father, he wrote, simply exclaimed when they died, "Bless the Lord, there's another safe landed." He means safe landed in heaven. Nor, in fact, did he evoke pain when talking about his own experiences working from the age of 7, 14-hour shifts in a Lancashire cotton mill. Rather, Townend only evoked the spectre of pain in the context of a severe burn that he got as a child. He overturned something on the fire, and basically it ended up with his arm being fused to his side, his entire right side. As a young adult, he went to the hospital, the pauper hospital, to have this cut free. And of course, again, like Jackson, anesthetics were not available. They wouldn't be available for another 23 years. And he was, in fact, not given anything, any analgesics, neither wine, whiskey, or laudanum was offered. He recalled, all was still, when, with a forceful thrust, through went the knife, as near the pit of the arm as possible, and close to my side. The progress of the instrument I distinctly heard. As, he put it, my smoking wound was being dressed, Townend simply said that he reflected on my past neglect and wickedness in resisting the Holy Spirit. So for Townend, this bodily agony was a gift given to him by a loving Heavenly Father. But he was equally clear that the function of pain was to teach him something, teach him to submit, not only to the hierarchies in the other world, but also to those in this world. When Townend attempted to thank his surgeon, what he did by shaking his hand, obviously using his left hand, the surgeon shouted at him, "Do you offer a gentleman your left hand?" He then grasped Townsend's right arm, dragged him off the bed. Immediately, Townend wrote, my leg and foot were covered with blood, and on the web of skin being loosed, I saw that it was turned black, and my poor side was drenched in blood and smoked almost like a kiln. So in other words, pain, he regarded this as a legitimate punishment for socially insulting a gentleman. In other words, pain for Townend performed two different acts. Firstly, it drew him into the exalted embrace of God's family, while reminding him of his lowly status in the family of man. His being in pain was, of course, a world away from later secular beings, in which pain no longer conceived of as an entity that had to be passively endured or even embraced. Rather, it was an enemy that had to be fought and ultimately defeated. When the pharmaceutical possibilities of eradicating acute pain was limited, endurance could actually be valorized as this kind of virtue. With the introduction of effective relief, this made passive endurance perverse rather than praiseworthy. Stripped of its mysticism and, of course, history and foundational theological texts, pain became an evil in itself, unequally distributed, affecting sinners as well as saints, and serving at most a limited diagnostic function. In other words, people in pain interpret their pain not as contained, isolated individual bodies, but an interaction with other bodies and social environments. It makes a difference whether pain is inflicted by an infuriated deity, whether it's due to the imbalance in the ebb and flows of bodily secretions that was widely believed in the 18th and 19th century, whether it's an inevitable punishment for a lifetime of bad habits like drinking too much wine, Dimitris, or whether it was the result of an invasion by a germ. Just to conclude, let's return to Sergeant Thomas Jackson that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. He had his limb amputated without anesthetics and suffered extreme agony for months afterwards. And this is the end, Jackson was said to have remonstrated, the end of a soldier's life, left here to die like a worn-out and useless hound. Better to have been killed outright than to be left thus. I would be a soldier, a man, and now I am worse than a sickly woman. So it was the sense of being unmanned, but also the sense of desertion by those around him that actually caused Jackson the greatest amount of pain. Indeed, part of the problem, I argue, of pain is the assumption that the body in pain is going to naturally elicit sympathy from witnesses. This was most blatantly argued by the anthropologist Margaret Mead. She argued that pain was, in her words, a form of experience so sharp, so unmistakable, so immediate, that members of any culture can recognize, empathize, or identify with another person in pain. The cry of genuine anguish knows no linguistic boundaries. On the contrary, I'd like to suggest that people routinely fail to hear others in pain. Indeed, Mead hints at this herself by claiming in that quote that only genuine cries of anguish constitute a universal language, thus opening the doors, of course, to claims that a person who says she is in pain is not genuine. Nevertheless, if we listen carefully, closely, pay attention to the language of pain, it emerges, I think, in many complex and historically nuanced ways. People in pain suffer in interaction with other people and environments. By carefully listening to the stories they are telling, physicians and other caregivers can find vital clues about the nature of this particular individual's suffering and how they can give succor. Sufferers, too, create new ways of living with and living through their pain. By knowing how people in the past have coped with painful ailments, I think we can all learn how to suffer better. We can also learn how to use it to forge communities. In other words, precisely because pain is social, shared with common language and customs, it can be turned into a positive force. Indeed, as many Greeks have done in response to years of social, political, and physiological pain during the crisis, pain actually can be used and is used to forge communities of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Η Joanna Birkbeck βεβαίως θα είναι μαζί μας σε όλη τη διάρκεια της επόμενης συζήτησης.
Joanna will be here with us during the course of the Q&A session, and we will be here a little later than planned because we started a little later. But if there are any questions, let's hold them back until the end. And Joanna has linked her work with what is happening in Greece today and the experiences of Greece today, probably experienced by many of you in the room. But she has sort of set the scene for all of our speakers this evening. The history of art professor, social anthropology professor, as well as the physician. And I think that all sort of feeds into what you are going to present us with. Three Greek well-known scientists, Pepi, Rigopoulou, Athena, Athanasiou, Panagiotakou. And they are going to, from their angle on, talk about the history of pain and how pain is part and parcel of everyday life. And they will, of course, open up their particular concept of pain into the dialogue. So we have Pepi Rigopoulou, who is a history of arts professor. She is very well known as a personality. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to describe what I feel in having you with us here this evening at this event. For her own generation and my generation, she constitutes quite a legend. And I think it's really very special to have her with us here tonight. She's actually a student of chemistry at university and then moved into the history of arts in the Sorbonne in Paris and then taught in Greece in the University of Crete, University of Athens, the Polytechnic of Crete as well, and she's now in the communications faculty of the University of Athens. Now, those of you who had the pleasure of having her as your professor will remember her very sort of legendary lectures about Narcissus, the body, and then she, of course, has another book that she's written, which is about the resuscitation chamber, the resuscitation room after operations. So I think Pepi is perhaps one of those people who can quite easily say that historical memory and national memory and personal physical memory may all converge at some point. So, having set the scene there for you, Pepi, it's over to you. So, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I am not acquainted with Mr. Papanikolaou, and we've only actually had communications per email so far, so not on first-name basis yet. But I was quite surprised by his extreme politeness, and this is something which I very much treasure in people, and of course the great honor he has bestowed upon me by inviting me to become a part of a discussion of Joanna Bourke's books. He suggested that we all look at things from our own angle on at the issue of pain, and then we'll have a discussion altogether. The book in question, I suggest you all read. I've read it myself. It's quite earth-shattering as a book, and it has really fed into a lot of my thoughts as well. It is quite a difficult venture here to try and address this issue here tonight, but I'll try and keep to the allotted time all the same, because this is an issue which I have entitled Pain as a Reenactment of Pain. So if you have a child that is suffering pain, they don't usually start crying immediately. It's only when people feel sorry for the child. The child is not actually crying at the pain, but rather at the performance of pain. So what makes us cry is not the pain itself, it is a foreign pain. Because in our imagination, we basically take up the position of the person who's suffering and see the common element of humanity and, of course, our own fate by extension. So it's after that that we usually start crying for ourselves. That's Schopenhauer. And then, of course, it's the pain of the other person as a spectacle. I'm not going to talk about subjective pain as a spectacle, as people might say in a philosophical sense, as per what Joanna addresses in her book. I'm going to talk about the pain of the other person as a re-performance in the sense of a theatrical performance and how that is depicted in art. Now, you see that there's an osmosis there, which to a certain extent it does not allow for any sort of categorization or compartmentalization. So perhaps I can just fill in information from different times and different places, but fully aware of the fact that when we talk about the past, whether it's our own past or another past, we're really talking about the present. I start from the complex relations between pain, which basically involve the death sentence and drama in ancient Greece. If you go back to ancient Greece, it's because, of course, there is a leitmotif that always takes us back to ancient Greece, in Greece, of course. In 1921, 50 years, in other words, before Foucault's book, as concerns punishment, Geramopoulos publishes his work, The Deflation, where he talks about findings in two cemeteries of the 5th century in Phaleron. They were, in fact, executed people, and in fact, the inflation technique was used. The ballooning technique of the body was used as a means of execution in ancient Greece, and of course this is linked into some sort of ritual. Now, in the Anthropology of Ancient Greece talks about quite an impressive link. In other words, you link between the Greek Mediterranean deities such as Dionysus, who suffer and are in pain, and that pain precedes any sort of exaltation. And what we must, of course, bear in mind here is that punishment and the pain of that punishment are deliberate by power and are deliberately made as some sort of spectacle. This is not simply for ancient times. Spartacus, Christ, and Damien, 18th century, Garrote in Spain, the electric chair, decapitation, crucifixion of IS today, punishment and pain caused are also educational, pedagogical punishments. This happened in antiquity, but also today. May not necessarily lead to death, it may be whipping or whatever. But it is true to say, as Foucault said, after Geramopoulos, Foucault, quite later on, after Geramopoulos, also said that Western societies gradually would lead to minimizing the duration of pain. However, if you look at the news at 8 o'clock, you'll see that this is not the case. The electric chair still exists. And also, perhaps we ought to think about pain involved in the infliction of punishment and how that is reenacted. How, through the whole procedure, you have, first of all, your audience, which is involved almost as an actor, as a perpetrator. And in many cases, you see, for example, in the case of stoning, it's not simply verbal abuse. You find actions also undertaken as a rule. And there are other theatrical elements. The protagonist, in other words, the victim, needs to have his costume, as Christ wore his toga. What about the yellow clothes and the cap with the guillotine? What about ISIS and the way that they dress their victims? Then the mask. Usually you have a mask involved, the mask of fear. And it's true to say that there are certain forms of punishment that still prevail even today. But other forms of punishment also involve the reenactment by the powers that be. What about in the case of Damien, who kills the king? And details of executions was a matter of providing the details to the audience. who were thirsty for those details. And pain, therefore, is for many people more shocking than death. I don't care whether I die. Suffice it for me not to actually experience pain, a friend of mine told me. And then often people who are terminally ill say, let me be released quickly from this pain. And then as concerns punishment, which leads you to the pain of the victim and for messages to be relayed, it's a matter of the duration of pain as well. Crucifixion or the wheel, these are punishments which have been designed to last for days or even hours, perhaps. And the forms of punishment are often designed precisely to take hours. Look at the concentration camps, but also events in other countries which try to see punishment as some sort of educational process. The dictatorship in Greece would hide its victims, but would spend a lot of time on describing the punishments, so that it was therefore part of its mission to act as a didactic message to the people. So you see descriptions of pain being used for a specific purpose. What about the martyrs of Christianity? What about the Roman arenas? What about the resistance that was incited to the Roman state? And then what about under the Ottoman Empire, where there was torture, and how one resisted torture? Of course, resistance to punishment or to subjugation is a leitmotif in history. And then, of course, resistance to the Nazis in Europe engendered a lot of such narrations in the world of art through theatre and drama and books. And Panagoulis, for example, in The Dictatorship, with his poems, do describe such events. But many people forget that the dictatorship, the colonels considered resistance as an important part of their particular power that they exercised. And we had the phenomenon of actually, if you like, plagiarism of pain of the victims. And after the restoration to democracy, you saw that this became almost a consumer item. And it became artificial in terms of separating out the pain from the body, alienation of pain from the body of those who had suffered pain, and then being used as a propaganda token through political messages. And then what about the reenactment or the reproduction of pain in art? Well, this is also important. I think that when we talk about Shakespeare and Marlowe's mirror of art, it's not necessarily a reflection of pain, because psychosomatic pain is an interplay between reality and imagination. What about Prometheus and his pain when he is chained to the rock? It doesn't reflect his pain. It doesn't reflect the pain of the victims that were found in the Phaleron cemetery, because the pain of Prometheus becomes the pain of mankind that wants to be liberated. So every text about pain is unique and is part of describing pain, for example, of Christ and the pain of crucifixion, which becomes part of the teachings of the Bible, and What about the crucifixion of Spartacus, a symbol, of course, of many revolutions? This basically can be seen in many different writings of the past. And don't forget Kubrick's film as well. Now, in part of my research recently, I'm trying to sort of concertina through time to pick up pain and punishment. And I think that perhaps the main feeling that all of the major medical steps supposedly were made in the West, but I'm trying to prove that that's not true, because a lot of things were happening in other civilizations much further back in time. In Byzantine, for example, depictions, plastic operations to reshape the nose, which had been cut off because of the punishment of cutting off one's nose. And I'm talking about 10th century separation of Siamese twins who didn't, of course, survive. One died from Armenia, but they were basically being displayed as freaks at the circuses, and then were brought to Constantinople. The operation was carried out with success, but there were complications, and the other twin died as well. Cutting off one's nose, or blinding, or cutting off the hand of the thief, which is imposed by the Sharia even today, are punishments, but also didactic spectacles. I mean, to actually reshape the nose, this was done by doctors, but it was some sort of mitigation of the punishment as well. So if I look back in the archives, the punishment of the saints, which were realistically depicted, and that's seen in Renaissance and medieval writings, but when you have this pain inflicted in, for example, in Byzantine times, the rule was to avoid any sort of expressionist depiction of pain. Supposedly, the martyrs were not to show pain, because that was to demonstrate how much they believed in their faith. In Byzantine miniatures, you don't have people's pain shown on their faces. And that's not something which is depicted when you have these icons painted. So it is true to say that Saint Sebastian of Mantegna or Saint Bartholomew in the Sistine Chapel, or other depictions, you see that their pain is seen as long-lasting. And Napoleon, amongst the people suffering from bubonic plague, is another depiction of pain. And of course, what you see is the courage of Napoleon, who is not afraid of the bubonic plague, rather than depicting the pain in those people who are suffering from the disease. And if you like, this is a matter of depicting la belle mort et la belle douleur, the wonderful death of the fighter and the wonderful pain of glory. So this is something which you see through history. But when we move on to the mutilated bodies and the theatre of war, and then through Tolstoy's writings, this really brings down all of the previous thinking of pain as an exaltation, because anti-war literature and All Quiet on the Western Front and other such books, the life and works of Grossman, or Johnny Got His Gun. These are all works which are counter-war, anti-war. So they basically want to score pain as a weapon of an anti-militarist rhetoric. And then, of course, you have Rembrandt's works and the anatomy theory of King's College. They lose something from the battle of dark over light, light over dark. And then, of course, you have Expressionism as we move into the 20th century, which offer the opportunity of there being a more direct presentation of pain and its consequences on pictorial arts. Van Gogh's picture with the ear cut off, and Guernica, Picasso. You see, pain is depicted through different means for different purposes. And Van Gogh's painting, of course, does send out a message. And there is, of course, a re-examination as per Artaud as concerns pain being a subject for pictorial arts. And this is important in terms of what we call somatic art or physical art, and then through the living theatre. And you have in Austria also a specific type of theatre. And basically, there's a central position now being given to pain as a message of some sort. I don't need to go into all of the different names that I have written down here, but there is one concept of the performers which reproduces, reenacts, purposely or not, the brutality of Artaud, and where the body is being mutilated, and where the pain that is thus engendered is depicted. However, in order for this artistic approach to pain to counterweigh the pain of power or war, one must understand that you are talking about a new cosmic universe where the symbolic and the real must recognize each other. Otherwise, there's no easy way. That's it. I think that that has given us a lot of food for thought as to what is engendered or produced by the human being in order to relieve suffering, and what is done on the other hand that is done in order to make more suffering, say through new war machines. You're inflicting pain on the one hand, and then art on the other hand trying to depict a pain as a counter image. Having listened to Pepi Rigopoulou, I want to move on to alternate professor for social anthropology, Athena, Athanasiou, at the Panteion University. She has studied at a new school for social research in New York. She did her doctorate there and then moved on to teaching and research on women in Brown University, United States, postdoctoral thesis, and then came back to Greece, where she talks about gender, new theories, feminism, feminist theories, which link in the gender with power and politics. She is one of the best known discussants with Judith Butler, and she's written some books which I've just lost off my screen, but I'm sure you know them all. But then, of course, she talks about the crisis as a matter of an emergency situation. That was her last book. but she also is an expert in anthropology of health. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be invited to address you tonight. Now, the voice that calls upon us in the most provocative way is that which causes pain, Joanna says, which of course gives you two different linked dimensions, voice and the demand. So these are two dimensions which go to the very heart of what our author is called the event of pain, which is immediate, it is ours, but it belongs to others. It's an event which links us with others and other people. So the body is vulnerable and opens one up to society, but it basically looks at violence and vulnerability. And of course, what is important here is that there is a linear relationship between pain and we of course say in Greek ephistame, which means I exist, but it also means I am suffering. So there's a dual meaning of ephistame in Greek, both suffering and being. Now, I think that perhaps there's a political question here as concerns our political conscience now. Does pain have any sort of history? And how can you relay that without, in fact, trying to describe what pain is? Now, I think this book has achieved the following. Not only does it provide an answer to what pain is, but it looks at the answer in a critical spirit. Now, history, of course, looks at pain as a raw material and the pain that a lot of people feel on an everyday level. But it's important to note that we do have national and individual events. Don't forget that often the story of the defeated does not become part of what we call history. So I think that what Michel Foucault was talking about really feeds into what Joanna says. Could we ask the speaker to read less fast? We do not have her text, unfortunately, so we would like to deliver an intelligent interpretation, but she's reading far too fast a text which we have not seen. Well, I'll try and give you a summary. Now, I think that what is important is that one should see where pain events take place and look at the history of pain in feelings, in love, in instinct. One should understand how pain is reproduced in order to be able to find what the common elements are of one's different roles. So I think that Joanna's book examines basically pain without there perhaps being a story behind it. I think that she reshapes the story of the present, which is not a matter of dialectic heroism, and apart from just describing events, is chiefly a methodology of critical thought, because she calls upon us to look at the asymmetric personal and political physical experiences of pain. And she also takes a very close look at important issue of historical, cultural and other processes which determine the history of pain several centuries back to the present today, how things have changed from the 18th century, how people respond to what is considered to be painful. And the book enables us to think about what is recognized as a pain, under what conditions, and also where are the exceptions. What is it in each event over the 3 centuries that were the conditions, the axiomatic systems, the context, which look at pain as part of a power system, a part of philanthropism, or how is it that the different hierarchies of gender, race, or ethnic origin feed into the feeling of pain, how you have a stratification of vulnerability. Now, pain perhaps does characterize the naked feelings of the individual, but it's also a matter of subjectivity. Some of us, in other words, are more vulnerable to the effect of pain, as well as the violence of non-recognition of pain. And this, of course, is something that we know full well, when the voice of the powers that be told them that, yes, the fact that you are suffering is what you deserve, and pain has therefore alienated them, has shattered them, has rid them of their dignity, and has made them also shirk themselves or cast off their dignity. I can't hear what the person is interjecting from the audience, so I cannot provide you with the translation. I'm sorry. But you are quite right, says the speaker. Now, as concerns vulnerability, and whether vulnerability is just or not, becomes important if we take into account that physical differences have often been used to limit any participation in the political body. Also, there were certain theories, and social Darwinism, for example, was transferred into a dominant principle of social imbalances and their legitimization. Now, what was it, for example, that made it possible for one not to give anesthetics to Afro-Americans, and that back in the 1890s, whereas ether was already being used 50 years beforehand, because they said, well, their nervous system is less developed, so less sensitive to pain. Or how is it, whereas women were considered to be more able to endure pain because of labor pains, from the end of the 19th century, they were seen as vulnerable and sensitive to pain. Well, women, of course, historically speaking, have been seen as subjects that can, in fact, endure pain more. They endure pain better, or they must endure pain better, is what is being said. So this, of course, is where you get the definition of women as mothers, and then, of course, physical pain is there because of the mother instinct, and this is therefore a feminine virtue. And doing away with labor pains was resisted by the church and some of the medical faculty, and even by some women. And supposedly women's sensitivity no longer exists if we're talking of non-white or poor white women. And the myth that non-white women do not feel labor pains was something that the medical science was talking about. And this was, of course, what made suffragette Elizabeth Constantin, after her very painful labor, to say, well, perhaps I'm an indigenous, perhaps. So, as Joanna Bourke has shown, after 1840, which is the sort of the breaking point beyond which there were analgesics, there were certain social prejudices which prevailed in terms of one's ability to endure pain. You see, this is where you find a line drawn between the pain threshold, and supposedly you can actually measure pain, and you can determine or even govern pain. Well, in this sense, the book enables us to understand the limits of pain and the limits of others as something which is at stake in the political and ideological sense. And that is the prism through which we can see the limits of political life within and social life within the urban context in terms of alienation or not. And Hannah Arendt would call this an abstract nakedness, the naked body, which is basically exposed to its limits, but constantly being put to the test. The naked body, which is experiencing pain. Now, pain, of course, within society takes on flesh, depending on who's next to you. Is there anybody next to you when you're experiencing pain? What about the gender? What about the social standing? As Joanna says quite rightly, you can't distribute democratically what you're feeling as pain. I mean, is it something that you can feel jointly or completely? Can you commonly share pain as one body? No, pain basically does not enable you to experience something in common. Virginia Woolf talks about an unexplored country and pain, how pain is experienced in that unexplored country. I must remind you, what is it that we do not have in common in society? So you may think of pain not as a class limit, but a vital dimension of society. How can we actually describe what is not necessary, but what is actually there? How can pain actually be structured? How is it that it is not available to other people's feelings? Joanna's book shows us that there is no real verbal expression of pain possible. Perhaps one might try to describe one's pain to the doctor. No. As Virginia Woolf says, your throat runs dry because how are you going to express, for example, a Hamlet or a Lear? You can find no words for pain or headache. So it's not only in English, it's in all languages. We tend to sort of use stereotypes, sharp, dull, acute pain, in an effort to try and describe what you're feeling. You may use gestures or movements, non-verbal exclamations to try and describe what basically escapes you in terms of verbal recognition. And as Bourke says, basically it's only some expressions of pain that can be seen as physiologically natural, because in a woman, for example, who says that she's in agony because a mouse is eating her intestines, she's actually put into a straitjacket. You see, it is the dumb and the soundless protest at something which is covered by social injustice. I mean, your very language is taken away from you, as well as the right to self-determination. Pain basically puts to the test the limits of language and its symbolization. And Woolf says that patients are called upon to produce new words and trying to create a noise which will express the pain, and a new word should spring up from this. When we're wounded, of course, we're really at the mercy of the limits of language, and we're trapped into the violence of silencing. We have to reconcile ourselves with our own vulnerability, but we're also called upon to create a language which aims at describing what we're suffering. Now, I know that this sounds like a hopeless situation, but Joanna, in her work, refers to what Walter Benjamin was saying, that basically she's able to reshape the spark of hope from the past. So, in conclusion, looking at the political context through history, we can use this as a prism in order to describe this feeling that one experiences through pain. We can perhaps understand how vulnerability in the democratic sense would enable us to put ourselves basically at the disposal of others on an equivocal basis. Or is it different vulnerabilities that will trigger a social equalization or not? So how do we understand vulnerability? This is necessary in order basically for us to regain our independence. Thank you.
Athena
Athanasiou just told us that while a community or a society keeps insisting on, or rather takes care of us not feeling in pain, once we realize that each and every one of us is in pain, then this can be the starting point for a different democracy. All of us, ladies and gentlemen, all of us, dear friends, we actually, whether you like it or not, we are representatives of the humanities. And we are dealing with pain one way or another, but from a distance. Angelos Panagiotakos is the last speaker. Last but not least, he's actually the only one of us who is trying to understand pain and possibly experience it. He's an anesthesiologist. He actually works in Italy. He is an expert in management, pain management for that matter. I've been impressed recently once I got deny him because he has clearly demonstrated that he looks forward to listening to all of us in order for him to improve in his work. He's actually in charge of a pain management clinic which is based in Turin, Italy. He's actually one of the very few European physicians, for that matter, who's really delved into pain management. So he's an expert, he's studied that, and he's also given me a list of things that I'm supposed to remind him of, and I'm sure I have more things to remind you of which are mine, so you will not leave this podium before you actually give us replies. Dimitris, I said so much, there's a handful of peers who've actually dealt with pain management from an academic point of view. I was trying to show you by stating so much, but that I'm not just one out of many or just one very rare person. Others have taught me what I know, so there are others there. On this occasion, allow me to express my thanks to your morphine pump, Joanna. The fact that it didn't work led to something quite positive. And yes, pain calls for something, and pain should not be blamed. Joanna enjoyed reading your book. Thank you so much. It was 300 pages long, and I've made lots of question marks and exclamation marks on the pages. I really love the book. Once I finished the book, your book, the first thing that crossed my mind was this. This is not a history of pain book. It's actually a book that has many pain stories. It's not the history of pain, it's a pain book or a pain storybook. So this is very important. These are stories which I live and experience on a daily basis, the way Joanna narrated it, of course. I'm not, of course, dealing with the sort of pain that my peers were dealing with back in the 18th century. We managed to manage that. But yes, I witness what Joanna has described, and through time, a handful of things has changed indeed. I don't know that just a handful of things has changed, and if just a few things have changed in the meantime, is it maybe because the narrative of pain is single, it's unique, it's just one? Or is it maybe that not so much has changed because we haven't managed so far to change the consciousness of pain? But one thing is true, understanding pain, realizing pain came recently in the field of medicine. The IASP definition of pain is the one that Joanna quoted earlier on. This definition was born a few decades ago. I think that Joanna has every right to dispute and refute this definition, and she's right. But then again, this does not include the essence of pain. Nonetheless, this definition allows patients to have a right for that pain to be acceptable, whether or not physicians understand the reason. When a patient says they're in pain, they are in pain indeed. It is not due to a psychosomatic cause. And from a historical point of view, we also need to actually practice our art, medicine, regardless of our impressions. It's also true that pain is what others feel. And
Αυτό που μου έχει κάνει πάρα πολύ μεγάλη εντύπωση είναι
what I was really struck by is the fact that even many medicinal environments or medical ambiences have no idea about pain itself. The Painful Truth Survey was conducted 2 years ago. Through this survey, an effort was made in order for the pain in contemporary Europe to be weighed somehow. And to me, this is meaningful. There were various countries. Here's the map. A few countries, for that matter, coming from Europe. They are depicted in orange. There were men and women who participated in this survey, and the survey encompassed just chronic patients who were aware of the fact that they were suffering from chronic pain, and these were also patients for whom there was treatment available. They had been in treatment for years, and it turned found out through the survey that chronic pain is an issue for every 1 out of 5 Europeans. At that point in time, that was the statistical ratio, and of course, more or less, everyone is expected to be dealing with some sort of chronic pain through life. On average, people have to go through chronic pain for 7 years. And a great number of those interviewed said that despite treatment, the pain they experience is in excess of 12 hours a day. The overall cost for the NHS in the countries that participated in this survey on an annual basis amounts to 300 billion euros. And this is the total debt of Greece, the national debt, the sovereign debt of ours. If we forget about acute pain, if we could somehow nullify chronic pain, then in a year we would have dealt with the sovereign debt of Greece. So you understand the size of investment that's called for. And it's also important to disseminate information and help people understand pain. We have to invest in that, and this will be cost effective. If we manage to do so, that is. A third of the patients that were interviewed claimed that despite treatment, they had not been informed enough as concerns pain. And these were countries that have established the right to receive information, and these are also countries that have introduced pain management clinics within the context of their own state-owned hospitals. Despite that, it turns out that chronic pain is an issue for 10% of cancer patients, and 90% of the rest of the patients are dealing with chronic pain. We have back pain. You see, we have there a picture or a drawing of a man and respective percentage rates. And what is really pestering to me as a professional is that 1/5 of chronic patients, chronic pain patients, will still be in pain for 20 years on average. So you see, chronic pain is not just an issue for others, but we have to understand that it was just back in the 1980s. I know that this graph is not clear, or maybe it's too clear. Prior to the 1980s, we didn't even have surveys and studies on pain. There was nothing available before the 1980s. It's only the past 5 years or so, it's been only the past 5 years or so that we've started studying pain, and we're trying to somehow figure out ways to deal with it. And anesthesiologists were the ones that kicked off this venture. It's not because we are smarter than the rest of our peers. It's just that it seems that we were really concerned about acute trauma, especially surgical trauma. We had to deal with that, and we also subsequently had to deal with chronic pain and come up with management forms thereof. Of course, in the two cases, we have two very different approaches. Anesthesia and painkillers have nothing to do with pain management per se. Joanna, in the final pages of her book, says that only 4% of universities or other medical schools in the UK have introduced modules and courses that are focused on pain management. I am a graduate of the University of Turin. It's a serious university, and it's true that we didn't have modules, nor did we have courses on pain management and pain per se. So all the knowledge that I got through anesthesiology and my respective studies were insufficient. That sort of knowledge was insufficient for me to practice medicine. So I do acknowledge that at this point in time, what is missing is academic training and education that would be sufficient enough in order for us to have pain therapists available for the sake of our patients. We're trying to do so much. Surgeons, anesthesiologists, certain specialties are trying to capitalize on available means and media we have in order for us to subsequently manage pain and act as practitioners, but this is not encompassed in academic work. And there are more problems when it comes to treatment.
όπως πολύ συχνά επισημαίνεις.
Time and again, and you've said so much, Joanna, in your book, there is also the influence of the environment. It seems that surroundings and people also exert pressure or ever influence the ways in which we manage pain or not. There are certain specificities and also features that are introduced by, say, religion. I don't believe that religion is something negative. I simply think that religion is a medium. It is a means, if you will. And religion tried to provide people with a code of conduct in order for people subsequently to understand pain. 2,000 years ago, it seems that people wrote books that suggested that when you feel in pain, do not treat yourselves as an unfortunate being. There's a reason why you're in pain. So just stay calm, don't be upset. The less upset you are, the faster the pain will subside. And so 2,000 years have gone by in the meantime, and now we have new means to manage pain. And thankfully, and fortunately enough, luckily enough, we have means now to deal with pain, and we can do so much quite effectively and efficiently for the majority of cases, or else my profession would have been really sad. Despite that, I enjoy my profession. I'm having a good time because we have the means. There's another issue that Joanna points at. She makes reference to the ways in which physicians deal with patients. The definition of pain is somehow turning a blind eye to interpreting pain. Patients need time. Joanna, you were to the point when you suggested that it's important to have time and understand, time in your hands, and understand all the expressions of pain, all the aspects thereof. There is the religious aspect thereof, there is the cultural aspect, there is the impact that pain has on our social life, on our sexual life, and of course pain changes personal relations, be they professional or others. So this all calls for time. In order for anyone to assess anyone's pain, physicians need at least an hour, and an hour is never enough for properly assessing a patient in pain. There's also the clinical and psychological impact of pain. I have come up with a simple way for me to do away with these obstacles. I always give my cell phone number to my patients so they can call me at any given time. And so I'm trying to facilitate them, and I explain to them the reasons why I'm giving them my phone number. I'm telling them that if you're faced with any problem whatsoever in terms of pain, I'm a doctor, I should know why you are feeling pain. And then there are also medicinal and pharmacological reasons why you may be in pain. And it will take me a couple of minutes to assess your situation after surgery. I actually, on an annual basis, I meet 600 patients on average. Only a handful have ever used my cell phone number. Despite that, or rather thanks to that, I think I have shaped an alliance. I've formed an alliance with my patients, and I'm building trust that way. This is how I build trust between me, the patient, and the treatment. I show them that I believe in my treatment. I show them that if it doesn't work for them, they can actually pester me. They can call me. And I am showing them that I'm there in order for us together to make it clear that proper treatment works. This is not what I do, but this clearly is the way in which pain management centers are working. To my understanding, these clinics are missing from Greece. There's no such thing as a pain management clinic. Oh, there are some in hospitals. Oh, good. Thank you for telling me, says the speaker. Yes, we're going to deal with that later on during the Q&A. Now, Angelos, who can have access to this sort of treatment or pain management, be it post-op or chronic? Or you may be referring to a culture of inequality? Are you maybe alleging that if you can afford this treatment, then you can get it? Or does it apply to everyone? I'm going to acquaint you with the reality I'm familiar with, and I'm not trying to insult anyone. Within the confines of the health system I work in, there is a piece of legislation. It was voted back in 2010. According to this new legislation, each and every patient has the right to go to their family doctor. There is the institution of the family doctor, so you can go to your family practitioner and they will actually refer you to a pain management center. So this is not a privilege that can be enjoyed by just a handful of people. This is actually a right that is being institutionalized for everyone. And I'm about to reach the end of my presentation. Hopefully you are not too tired, says the speaker. And at this point, allow me to show you this slide, this particular slide from The Lancet. The Lancet is a very important journal when it comes to the science of medicine. And this is meaningful to you, Joanna. It was written back in November 2014, for that matter. This is about the systematic neglect of culture in health and healthcare. And this, according to The Lancet, is the single biggest barrier to the advancement of the highest standard of health worldwide, says The Lancet. I believe that this is one of the biggest truths that have ever been written recently. Thank you.
Δεν ξέρω αν νιώσατε αυτό που ένιωσα και εγώ, ότι η φωνή του Άγγελου.
So the voice of Angelos, I think, is therapeutic for pain. I don't know whether you felt the same thing as I did. I have a lot of questions myself, but I fully understand that many people in the audience would want to also submit questions. Some of us here behind the table deal with subjects where pain are right at the center of our subject, whether it's history of art or is it literature, anthropology, which of course deals with the people who are suffering and wish to talk about their pain, and history, perhaps marginalized pain more. We usually in history talk about the person who attacks rather than the attacked, and the person feeling pain. And in medical science, the therapy of pain that you were referring to, Angelos, I understand that the theory of pain is not really at the center of your activities, whereas therapy more is at the center of what you do. I think that's what you were saying, why doctors have not earlier on done more to understand how to alleviate pain rather than just the symptoms. That's basically what you were saying. Yes, because pain really is what Joanna has described in her book. The first reason for one to have access to the health system, national health system, and the biggest problem that we have in medical science, you cannot control pain simply by giving people aspirin. Okay, well, perhaps we can open up to questions now. Now, I know that there are a lot of questions and from different angles on, or perhaps from different disciplines sometimes. So please do submit very short and direct questions if you can, with a microphone so we can provide a translation.
Λοιπόν, μια στιγμή θέλω να δω λίγο. Η κυρία, συγγνώμη, θα σας οδηγώ εγώ με το μικρόφωνο. Η κυρία που είναι εδώ μπροστά.
Recognize you here in the front.
Και υπάρχει μια άλλη κυρία πίσω.
With a microphone, yes. Good evening and thanks to our speakers. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I'm an anaesthetist and I work in the cancer hospital here in Athens, and we have links into a lot of European centres dealing with pain. To give you Greek reality, we have 45 recognised surgeries in hospitals around the country dealing with pain, and there is a site, Palliative.gr, that links up these surgeries, which are there to alleviate pain. So we're not that backward in Greece, and there are, of course, a lot of problems because of the hospitals, organisations, not all having a pain surgery. There's an effort at achieving that, however, as well as for cancer patients offering alleviation as well, and counselling. So we're not in the dark ages in history. A lot of young people who are anaesthetists want to work in this particular sector. The work that we do is on a voluntary basis and not actually paid extra. So we have to basically take out time from our basic job to deal with this, which would add to the number of hours dedicated, although we can't dedicate too many hours to this. Thank you. Joanna, did you want to say something? I would like to thank you for having giving us that information, and you really confirm what we're saying, that what you do is seen as an addition, as complementary. Of course, well, I just directed you to the sites that we have on the internet. Hopefully in the future we can actually create jobs for young people by establishing a whole organisation for this. But Joanna, did you want to say something?
Just very, sorry, I hear my own echo. Just very briefly there. I mean, thanks very much. I think one of the problems, at least in my country, in Britain, is that this outsourcing of pain management to pain clinics. Pain clinics and surgeries are doing fantastic jobs. They are lifesavers, literally, for millions of people in chronic, very serious chronic pain. I think, though, we do need to think about educating physicians more generally about pain, and I think that's where the problem is right now. There's so little training. They've physicians, general physicians are saying, oh, other people are doing that, it's not for us. Whereas, of course, the thing that brings people to the doctor's surgery, by and large, is I'm hurting here. And yet general doctors are actually not doing that as much as they ought to. Pain clinics are doing a fantastic job.
Μία ερώτηση, η κυρία που ήταν...
Another question from the lady in brown.
Και δεν ξέρω αν υπάρχουν και από εδώ ερωτήσεις. Νομίζω... Ναι, υπάρχει και... Ναι. Σας ακούμε.
Θα ήθελα...
I like to just add to what the previous speaker said. I'm a pediatrician, and I'd like to talk about something which is totally neglected, which is the pain of children, which cannot be verbally expressed. It's non-verbally. What about a premature child, for example, a premature baby? And of course, we too are working in this field. We do have alleviatory treatment and home care for terminal child patients, and it's not only doctors and nurses, but we have psychologists as well, and a family involved, so that one can give support to the child. That's all I wanted to add. But we have to sort of put ourselves in the position of the child and how to alleviate the pain of children. Well, perhaps I can just repeat what was heard. When I first read this, I was quite shattered. The idea of these young, premature babies who are subject to so many different treatments, examinations, and in needles, and perhaps one should have thought a little bit more about how the fact that these children are also suffering.
I do a lot with infants in the book. What's very interesting, I think, about the pain of infants is change over time. Infants in the 18th century were regarded as exquisitely sensitive to pain, and they were treated actually very, very well in the context of course, what was available. It's only in the 19th century, in fact, we actually know the date. In Western medicine, it is in 1878, where all of a sudden it's decided that infants do not feel pain at all. And this is when you get, for the first time in medical communities, you get full operations, including amputations, etc., taking place on infants without any form whatsoever of analgesics. And that in Britain, only changed in the 1970s. So right up until the 1970s in Britain, you are having infants with full operations without any anesthetics. But of course, this is a broader problem about who really feels. And we can see this change in many, many situations. Do women truly feel? Do animals truly feel? Do African Americans feel? Do the savages feel? And of course, the answer to those questions have huge ramifications for individual suffering.
I think perhaps another very important issue as part of the discussion is what happens in the womb and the embryo within the womb. I mean, of course, this is a whole different subject for discussion. I was talking to one of my students who asked me this question when we were talking about such issues in lecture. If you have an in vitro embryo formed, what happens? Do they have the same sort of cause? What sort of pain do they feel? What happens with the development of the nervous system? Well, these are issues which are quite well, it's a matter of bioethics as well. It's quite earth-shattering. I think that perhaps you doctors will have looked at this more, but for my part, I'm a volunteer through university and with people who deal with wounds. We could have great collaboration between ourselves. So this collaboration would, and your experience, would be most vital to us in our teaching. I don't actually have a question as such. Two issues which I think are very important. First of all, if you have in the family somebody who is different, we don't know who actually experiences the more pain. Is it the person with the problem or the people who surround that individual? Another issue, which is very important also, is the power exercised by centers that are responsible for providing information to society. My father suffers from cancer. I feel the power wielded by doctors in terms of information. Thank you. Let me answer that, if I may. This is what I think has changed over the past few years, because I did not in any way want to insult people who are interested in pain and alleviate pain wherever they are. I'm just saying that we need to have an organized system within the national health system to obviously people who work with pain can work within the NHS, but a health system has to provide alleviation, has to actually enshrine and encapsulate that in legislation. I think that's so important because the reality that you see in the UK is a very positive one, and could be taken as an example to emulate in terms of pain treatment, especially in terminal situations. The role of the doctor is an advisory one because he has the information, which is specialized information, because patients don't normally have access to that information, and the decisions taken in the therapy of pain at any point in one's life have to be taken by the patient in collaboration with the doctor, who has to provide the therapy. But it's not a matter of wielding power over the individual. It has to be a matter of collaboration, surely, between the doctor and the patient. That's how we would like to think that we work, not, of course, forgetting all the mistakes of the past that have been mentioned. Yes, I think that the question was as concerns information. Who wields power because of the information that they have? And I think that you linked in those two issues together, as you linked in the pain of the one individual with the other individual, of a member of the family who has a particular problem, and the family context and how the support is provided by family members.
I think this is a very, very important point that you're making. I think it's really crucial that we remember that people in pain also are internalizing certain assumptions about the comportment, how they're supposed to comport themselves. And one of the things that really struck me in my own research is people in pain actually saying, I refuse to talk about my pain. I refuse to communicate it. Not simply, although partly, of course, because fears that others won't believe them or fears that they will be dismissed, but also, and this comes to what you were saying, but also fears that they risk becoming inflictors of pain on their loved ones, on their caregivers. So in other words, that a person in pain actually may not wish to speak about it precisely in order to avoid inflicting pain on those people that they love and care about. That is something I think we really need to think very carefully about how that can actually change, because that is actually a very, very big problem.
Yes, very briefly, because the two issues that you have posed are so important and go to the very heart of our discussion this evening. I'd like to say, first of all, that pain is understood and felt only within the conditions of a community, and thus circulates amongst individuals. And the question really is, under what conditions and in which manner, whether vulnerability becomes the object of exploitation and submission, or whether it is a cause for therapeutic alliances, which is what we're trying to achieve. And then the second question. Yes, it is a matter of the people who are around you, and the person who is actually suffering wants to maintain one's integrity and personality completely. Yes, I think to a great extent the question is an open one. I don't think that the conditions and the times of the crisis should be seen as a springboard for relating that to other individuals or other contexts. What I'm trying to say is that perhaps it can also be a subject of research. Yes, I agree. That, I mean, I'm not really looking for an answer from you. I'm just putting it forward as perhaps something that could be researched. Yes, I think that's true. I think that when you talked about the relations of power, authority is quite interesting as you set the issue. I, of course, I'm very grateful for advances in science, but you see, authority does exist in society, or power is wielded by certain individuals in society, and these relations of power have to be looked at, because often pacification and victimization of patients was a problem, because they were considered to be simply passive receivers of treatment without being involved in the type of treatment being given. And that is something which is perhaps changing now. Mrs. Rigopoulou. Very, very quickly, because I know that more people want to ask questions. I'm very interested in the point that you raised. The person who suffers has also narcissism in terms of passivity vis-à-vis the doctor, but also as concerns one's own environment in trying to maintain one's own personality, as you said, and integrity, and to refuse to have relations with the environment. We've seen such cases, and this narcissism is developed because one feels vulnerable as an individual, and you want to try and survive at all costs. It is a major issue, really, and I'm not quite sure how it can be solved, or if it can be solved. I think that what perhaps is important in terms of the doctors is that many doctors, many physicians think that patients are children and that they're starting their life from zero. So I think it's also a class stance. I mean, if you have money and fame, you're treated differently. But if you are Mr. Nobody, as Ulysses was, then people don't really take any notice of you. Now, there's something I want to say. When we generalize, we do run certain risks. On the one hand, we agree it's a class issue, which hopefully, as time passes, is now vanishing or disappearing. But you see, people volunteering, as you said, using their free time to offer this pain alleviation. I was very moved by that. I think also I was very moved by people who work in the health sector who have been affected with the Ebola disease. You see, they were infected not because they were careless, but because they stayed somewhat more longer in order to provide better care to the patient. And it was that moment in time that where they were infected. So that, I think, is an example of selflessness. So doctors who, at one at the same time, as you've been saying, can make this self-sacrifice and help somebody suffering and can help alleviate pain, or to just undertake a small action which will alleviate the pain of the patient. Well, I was very impressed by the presentations this evening. We were talking about physical pain. Some reference was made also to social pain, but perhaps outside of the context here. What about spiritual, mental pain, which has its somatic, what we call psychosomatic pain? I don't know whether it's your specialization, or can you help people with psychosomatic pain? Perhaps we ought to just think about this for a minute. Joanna first?
Very, very quickly. I argue very strongly that it's not helpful to separate out physical pain and mental pain or emotional pain into very separate components. I think, psychological pain always has a physiological component to it. When I have a fight with someone, I feel it in my body as well as in my mind or in my heart or whatever. And equally, a physical pain always has an emotional component to it. These two things are always operating together. This is why I said in my paper, a heartache and a heart attack. These are similar sorts of things. And I think one of the ways that medicine is changing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you being the expert, is that it's beginning actually to acknowledge the interrelationship between those two parts of human life.
That's precisely it. There's no difference between emotional and physical pain. You can't draw a dividing line. When people say that they are in pain, they are in pain. That is the International Association for the Study of Pain's definition. Pain is pain. If people feel pain, then it is pain. I mean, with new diagnostic means we have to hand, we are beginning to understand what is actually happening in terms of emotional pain and to depict it. But it doesn't change the reality of the pain actually existing. And as part of pain therapy, we don't only use painkillers. Characteristically speaking, we recognize that certain substances, if, for example, if you have some sort of pain to the hip, then, or sciatica, that you can actually insert something into the bone marrow. If, for example, a substance is missing from the marrow, then you have an increase in pain and an increase in depression, apparently. So there's a sort of a vicious cycle. If I have more sciatica, I have depression, or do I have depression because I have sciatica? It doesn't really matter. I mean, it's the end result that is important. So I have to, something will bring the patient into me, which will be pain. I've not asked whether it's emotional or physical pain. Nobody's come to me. Perhaps the pain alleviation or pain treatment centres are not organised properly to attract people who have some sort of emotional pain. So people don't come into me because they're mourning somebody. They come into me because they have physical pain. So pain is pain, even if it is emotional pain. I mean, everything affects our body. Athena Athanasiou gave us the example of what we would call biological or physical pain, And we heard somebody from the audience on this. And the second point raised here, the person here who has experience of chronic pain links in also the emotional pain of the family with that physical pain. So you have emotional and physical pain in the same sentence. Now, I think perhaps some of you are tired and are leaving us. But I'd like to ask you if we could take a couple of questions, or all of the questions together, and then we'll have them answered so that we can finish. So we'll have just a last round of questions, and then we'll have to finish very, very quickly. Just bear with us for a few minutes. I'd like to address myself to the doctor and say that we were taught in the past that pain is basically a warning sign for protection purpose. But I recently heard somebody say, don't forget that pain is basically some sort of disease. I mean, is that right? Is there any sort of literature on this? There was some sort of historical reference, but is there anything that could help us recognize pain? Is there anything in the literature that would help us on that? Bibliography? And were you here in the dictatorship, Mrs. Rigopoulou? Did something unfortunate happen to you in the dictatorship? Because I think that's something which I seem to understand that you suffered something during the dictatorship which has affected you. Could you tell us about it? I did say something in my introduction, but anyway, over to the doctor. Yes, the information is quite right. There is a difference between acute pain from a wound or an injury, which of course has the object of not continuing with the wounding, and there is also a different form of pain. I mean, we're not built for purpose. Supposedly, we're only built for 35 years duration. In the 1800s, life expectancy was 35. And today, where you have national health systems which do not function properly, in Europe, the life expectancy is 56 or 58. In Greece, we have an NHS which is sufficient. That's why we live on average for longer. We have not been built, therefore, for us to know the period of time. Our nervous system has not been constructed to know that pain, which perhaps comes from perhaps the bones that are in fact hurting joint lesions, for example, are there because of wear and tear. Mrs. Rigopoulou. So before we take 1, 2, 3 questions, that's it, no more. Please do submit your questions, and that will be the end of the discussion. 4 questions, and that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and please no more. Quickly together. Good evening. Thank you to the speakers. Question to Mrs. Bourke. If via your research for your book, The History of Pain, whether there have been cases where you have some sort of positive outcome in terms of the pain. And from the other speakers, a comment as to idealized pain. Next question.
Εγώ απλώς ήθελα να ρωτήσω κάτι διτό.
Twofold question. From research undertaken, is pain something that can be dealt with on the psychological level? Can somatic pain be alleviated mentally? Can it be alleviated? Or can one become accustomed to pain? Is there some sort of method for us to become accustomed to pain? So if I do have chronic pain of 15 or 20 years, that I live with this pain, that I reconcile myself to live with this pain. My son works in Germany as a psychologist with specialization in pain, in dealing with constant pain. And of course, he wants to come back to Greece, so perhaps I can just coming back to Greece. Can he work in this field? Well, you as mother understand his pain. Yeah, of course, as a mother, you are also suffering. Okay, one last question.
Υπάρχει μια τελευταία ερώτηση.
One last question, Mr. Kouvelas.
Αν βλέπω καλά. Λοιπόν, εδώ είναι... Ναι, το ξέρω και σας είδα. Φαντάζομαι θα είναι ερώτηση και απάντηση από τον κύριο Κούβελα.
Καλησπέρα σας.
Good evening.
Εκεί να διαβάσω βιβλία.
Συγγνώμη, σας είπα αλλιώς δεν μιλάει.
Good evening.
Εκεί να διαβάσω βιβλία για το τι τραβήξαν οι άνθρωποι.
As concerns Siberia and in other countries, I've read about the pain that was suffered by people who were punished. Can you go crazy with pain? And if you go crazy, do you suffer less pain?
Θέλω το μικρόφωνο να έρθει εδώ αν γίνεται.
One last question down here. I'll give the speakers time to answer, and the person to answer last will be Joanna, last but not least. But there's somebody here in the front who says that they have the answer to a question. First of all, congratulations. It's an honor for me to be here to answer as to whether one can live with pain. I have lived with pain since the age of 8 because of migraine pain, and I've made it a protagonist in my life. I no longer fear the pain. I know it comes, but I know it will go. So that's my answer to that one. Okay, so let's start now with the answers. Do you want to speak first? Athena first. Joanna speaking last. You'll have the last word, Joanna, tonight. Okay, just a couple of things as concerns idealized pain. No time to analyze this, but a very interesting subject. Historically speaking, and Joanna, you correct me, but anthropologically speaking, there are processes, sublimation processes, where one lives pain as if it's something magnificent, glorious and splendid. But here too, there is a stratification. Different types of pain and perhaps have a greater propensity to becoming idealized. Look at Kafka's description of tuberculosis. It's an idealized description. He says that my tuberculosis is my mistress, my lover, and we've not seen similar processes of idealization of other types of pain. perhaps pain which is more socially cannot be romanticized, as in the case of Kafka, where you had the sort of skinny white faces which were sort of romanticized almost. What about HIV? Can you romanticize about that? No, I don't think so. So I insist that there is a sort of a social stratification in terms of vulnerability, even in the idealization of pain. Well, in Western societies and white males, there's a whole culture of idealization of HIV. And if you idealize in ACT UP, you remember where they idealize to the contrary with the die-ins, people sort of collapsing in front of the Capitol and pretending to be dead. But what Dimitris said is also true, but there is a difference in the whole process of idealization. Sorry to butt in again. Next, Angelos, Pepi, and then Joanna.
I really have nothing to add. The explanation was succinct. As concerns managing pain from a psychological point of view, indeed, there are techniques on offer, techniques which allow for pain management. And of course, it goes without saying that the sense of pain depends on our psychological status. According to various surveys, even pain post-op depends on how you felt at the time when you decided to undergo surgery. So there are nonetheless means and tools. Nothing will suffice on its own. The psychological tool or psychological management tool will not suffice in the absence of a technical, medicinal or pharmaceutical tool. What is called for is the overall range of pain management, which is multifaceted and multilateral. Now, as concerns madness and pain, of course it's possible. You can go crazy even from pain, even because maybe you have back pain and you have 4 children and you can't afford to make a decent living. You can commit suicide because of that. It's not that you go crazy, but you know a lot of things can happen. I believe that actually people are in pain in such circumstances even worse than others. Maybe the expression, the social expression of pain changes. Maybe the ones that are suffering from mental diseases are suffering the impact thereof from a social point of view, but the essence of pain is still there. Athena, well, it's about what you said, Pepi Rigopoulou. Lately, I've been reading a book. It was written by Vasily Grossman. The title is Life and Destiny. He is the Tolstoy of the 20th century. I would strongly recommend you read this book. It is in this book that you will read about human stories. Stories in which the most excruciating thing is not pain, but rather the fact that these people who are suffering are feeling alienated from themselves, their ideology, everything that they have actually lived for. And this is immense. You're cut off from what you did for a lifetime. You know what? This is what we've been through in Greece in recent years. The accusations that we've been subject to in recent years could have possibly dealt us a death blow. It was, after all, a blow to our identity. We are not being persecuted like the Jews. As we speak, I don't care about political parties, nor is this partisan talk, but I know that something is about to change. It's another story, nonetheless. Now, I do not know your name. I'm referring to you, dear lady. You shared your pain with us. And I think that gatherings such as this tonight are very important in the sense that they allow scope for us to communicate our thoughts. I know it is difficult to air our views or our concerns, but then again, we are exposed and it's a good thing. If there is one fundamental reason why we meet, is to have a conversation and we can share our innate and intrinsic thoughts, even our fears. It's important to share our fears. Books were written. Those books say that people during the German occupation managed to make it because they made communities, and in their own communities they had gatherings and they shared the problems. The more you just keep your problems and concerns to yourselves, the problems turn into pain. Often they become a burden. It is good to share that burden. One last thing. What can I say? I'm neither the first nor will I be the last that went through something that happened a few years ago. There have been so many people, there are so many people on a daily basis that are going through trials and tribulations. The story is going on. No matter what people allege, there's no end to our history and stories. Human suffering and pain confirms that there's no end to history. And what I can still recall is those terrible nights spent in hotels, and hospitals rather. And these are terrible nights in hospitals. You might fall in love with people and you might hate people there. It's tremendous, it's horrific. Changes happen at night in hospitals. Even martyrs, avoid them. I mean, doctors would rather not be there at night. Nurses sometimes are bored. Even family members and relatives don't want to be there. You see, hospital nights can be terrible. Thank you. I will let Joanna Birkbeck have the final word. We were all equitable and hopefully we were just and fair in the way we shared our time. But Joanna, and we have to pay tribute to herself, is our guest, and she provided us with impetus and stimuli. She's flown in from the UK. Angelos just flew in from Italy, so I guess she deserves to be the last tonight. We are putting Joanna at the heart and the core of this event, and she will have the last word, as I said. But before we conclude, let me just underscore this. We had a long discussion that showed how much we want to talk about pain. And this discussion tonight also showed to us that a lot is missing and we need to do a lot. It was a great pleasure and an honor to have you, all of you, tonight. And I have to apologize to those friends of ours who were unable to join us in here and who had to stay downstairs. A big thanks goes to the Onassis Cultural Center. They're always taking good care of us. And at this critical point in time when the things were tough, they did the best they could. This panel discussion will continue. This subject matter will be dealt with again. And one of our fundamental objectives tonight is to make sure that we capitalize on this occasion to insist on how important such subjects are. Please help us proceed with that and continue our venture. You've been instrumental so far, after all, and I know there's a lot for me to say and I'm forgetting about it. Let me thank each and every one of you, the technicians, and of course Afroditi Panagiotakou, who's been involved as of day one in this venture. And let me now give the floor to Joanna by saying this. Joanna, just like you saw for yourself, you gave us food for thought and there were lots of concerns, and this is one of the longest discussions I've seen. People are still with us. So your last remarks, some comments that are pertinent to what we heard, and maybe you want to make a statement, I don't know.
Me have the last word. No one has ever given me that opportunity before. So how long do we have? No, I actually just want to say, I think it's really quite remarkable the way this panel has been put together. I think in terms of the disciplines and also the approaches, and purely by coincidence, we all really looked at very different but complementary aspects. I mean, your emphasis on representation, but what really struck me about your paper, your talk, was the notion of pain as theatrical, the importance of comportment, how you comport yourself makes a difference. I found that really, really interesting. But the politics of vulnerability goes to the heart, I think, of everything that we need to be talking much more about. And of course, can you be my doctor? I mean, talking about, one of the questions was, what was it? Somatic pain be alleviated by psychological means. You could alleviate all my pains. But also, I think there is a real important issue here about the medicalization of pain. I'm not simply talking about tablets, but the way certain peoples get under-medicalized or get less help than other people in pain. And of course, you also, Dimitri, had some wonderful things to say about the emotional labor involved in pain. And often that emotional labor is, of course, is hidden. It's hidden in domestic spheres. It's not given the credit that it really, really deserves. Because, of course, even though pain is universally experienced, it is, of course, interpreted differently in different cultures, between different peoples. And I'm just really echoing what was said earlier, this positive outcome. I think, yes, pain can have a positive outcome because pain can create communities of sympathy. And if we listen carefully to people in pain telling us about their experiences, listen carefully to the metaphors that are used, I think actually we can make huge improvements in the way we actually reach out to those sufferers, reach out to those others in pain. So, but basically, questions and discussions, fantastic. Thank you to all of you people. Really enjoyed myself.
Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ.